Hello everyone, my name is Boulevard. Welcome to Tournament Tactician, the premier tournament tier list for Legends of Runeterra here on patch 3.6. Let me give you a breakdown on what we're looking at here today. So next weekend is the Curious Journey Seasonal, which means that next Wednesday I will be putting out a longer, more in-depth version of Tournament Tactician, probably 30 to 40 minutes long as I tend to do, going over the meta and lineups and just being a well-researched, good video for you to watch and have information on. So rather than go in-depth on things this week, I'm really just kind of looking to lay the groundwork for you, especially since I didn't get out a Tournament Tactician last week because I was moving and the various bugs and things of that nature. So I really just want to talk about the decks, where I feel like they stand power level wise, maybe a little bit of the meta placement within them, but I'm not really going to be talking about lineups because this is the last weekend where you get to try new things. We have the online league series, we have the Mastering Runeterra GGToor tournament. I highly encourage you to enter at least one of those, as well as these Mastering Runeterra dailies that are running. You have to be a subscriber, I think either to their Twitch channel or their Patreon or maybe on their website, and then they're free to enter once you are a premium subscriber. I definitely think it's worth the money, especially the content that these guys are putting out is absolutely crazy. So definitely sign up for the Mastering Runeterra stuff. Just get those reps in as we head into the seasonal tournament. But like I said, I just want to take a look at where the meta stands, where these decks are falling in, because we have three decks that are really pulling away from the rest of the pack, and that's Mono, Shurima, Ziggs, Taliyah, and Pantheon. Now, Pantheon got a big boost, not only from the rules change, where if you target a Fated unit with a Zenith Blade, they now get the +1/+1 immediately, making it harder to remove those units before the slow spell resolves, and Zenith Blade, of course, being one of the more impactful spells that you can play on a Fated unit, as well as Yordles and Arms taking a hit. So the way that players were beating Pantheon previously was you would go very wide with Yordles and Arms or decks that were playing a similar playstyle. Control was doing a little bit better because they didn't have to focus on beating all these different things. They really just had to focus on beating like Yordles and Arms, and they just kind of accidentally beat Pantheon. With all of those things out of the way, Pantheon is definitely coming up in a big way. Yes, the Shurima decks have Quicksand, but, you know, Pantheon can either roll Spell Shield, which they don't have a very clean way of removing, or you just kind of beat them down with this Wounded White Flame that gets progressively bigger over the game, and they only have so many Quicksands. They're probably only going to draw one or two over the course of the game, right? Like, they play three, but they probably didn't draw all three. I digress. Point is, Pantheon and the Shurima decks are very much pulling away from the rest of the pack. Feel the Rush is another hotly talked about deck. The problem that I have with it, and the reason that I didn't finalize it in Tier 1, is because it's not doing great against the other Tier 1 decks, making it sort of an unappealing option across the board, but also it doesn't do very well into Scouts. And a lot of people, especially as we approach the seasonal, historically, Scouts gets a big boost right before the seasonal and during the seasonal. You know, it won't do anything for the entire meta, and then all of a sudden, a week before, everybody remembers that Scouts exist. So I wouldn't be surprised to see Scouts have a big uptick this weekend. It does pretty well into Shurima, and that is a deck that also accidentally beats Feel the Rush. It does pretty well into Pantheon as well, because it is one of our go-wide decks that survived from the previous meta. So I think that Feel the Rush is just going to be in an awkward position where you're not really beating the Shurima decks in Tier 1, and then the Scouts deck that is likely to have a large surge over this weekend to beat Pantheon and the Shurima decks is just also accidentally going to beat you. Therefore, FTR is down in Tier 2, but the deck is still good. You can still bring it. You can still win a tournament with it. I just want to give a word of warning to you. Now, Pantheon, because Yordles and Arms got nerfed, there's less go-wide decks, which is what Pantheon was losing to previously. So Pantheon's just kind of stealing the show. It is what it is. Let's talk Tier 2, but these are definitely like these three decks, Sundisk, Pantheon, Ziggs, Taliyah, they are a cut above the rest. So I've run into problems in the past where one player is doing well with a deck, and you'll see other people kind of sparingly doing okay with it, but it makes it kind of hard to judge whether that player is good with that comfort deck or if the deck is actually good. And Prodigy has topped, I believe, the last two Mastering Runeterra dailies with Shurima Viego, and running that alongside Sundisk and Ziggs Taliyah as sort of the triple Shurima lineup, but it's been Prodigy both times, I think taking a first in the top 4. So it's hard to know if Prodigy's just very good at Viego Shurima, or if this is the new version of Viego, because I'm very big on Viego Ionia. I mentioned previously that I thought it was sort of poised to take over FTR's spot as the best control deck of patch 3.4. Kind of worked out that way, doesn't really matter. Point is, it seems to be falling to the wayside for the Shurima Mono Viego, just because Shurima's got a lot of great tools. People are really starting to pick up on Hourglass in a big way, just kind of exploring what other decks we can put Ancient Hourglass into, and Viego is the one that seems to be coming out on top of that. So the Shurima version is a little bit more popular. Still really like the Ionia version. I think this is one of the better Vengeance decks out there, probably the better way to put it. But you know, it's a little untested, at least on mass. So we'll see how that one goes. But I do think that Viego is in a very good spot. I wouldn't be surprised to see this tick up over the weekend. Scouts is Scouts. It's getting its seasonal power spike. Zillion Echo, I think, is a fine deck. I think people kind of forgot about it. But Zillion Echo has always been a deck that needs a very specific meta to thrive. And we finally found that in patch 3.4. I've seen whispers about Zillion Echo kind of coming back or not being dead. People definitely jumped ship on it. The diehards are still there. But I think Zillion Echo is actually in a pretty okay spot. Yeah, there's not as many Vengeances and Ruinations previously. You're not getting these big blowouts with the Chrono Break like you used to, because not as many people are worried about wiping your board. But I still think that Zillion Echo is a good deck, and I'm probably going to take this to ladder a bit this weekend to try to really hone in on how I feel about it, because I don't want people to forget about this deck going into the seasonal with how much a buzz there was about it sort of in the earlier days of patch 3.4. Aphelios, or Aphelios, it's a really cool pun when written out. It's not as fun to say. This is just an Aphelios Fizz attached deck, just in case you haven't seen it, using Gleaming Lantern and then Rainbow Fish, as well as the Papercraft Dragon with Fizz, Infernum, all that kind of stuff, just to try and, you know, it's a Fizz combo deck with Aphelios. Nothing super crazy, but definitely very solid. People are really picking up on this one in tournament. It's been taken over the top cuts of the Mastering Runeterra dailies. I'm a pretty big fan of it. I tried building something like this back in... I actually went into my Runeterra AR. I tried building something like this on April 10th. But I went like Aphelios and Yuumi, and I didn't want 3 Yuumi, so I kind of just like threw in a Pantheon. But I wasn't on the go wide strategy as much. I was playing like faded units, so I was trying to go tall, and I think that's where I went wrong. This is very much a go wide deck, and I think that is probably the better way to play it, and just look for that finish with the Fizz. Now, I've got this listed as aggro, but I want to clarify that this is aggro in the same sense that Yordles in Arms is aggro, not in the same sense that Spiders is aggro. You know, you kind of walk that mid-range line, but at the end of the day, they are looking to just kill you as fast as possible with a Fizz and a Papercraft Dragon, so that is what it is. Jace Lux is the most recent flavor of the day deck of the Mastering Runeterra events. At the very start of the run of these road to seasonal tournaments, I think Victor Lee was the deck that players were still looking at from last patches, like, hey, this is the flavor of the day. Then Sentinel Control had like half a minute in the spotlight, and then Lux Jace kind of took over. I don't think in the last, that was like 3-4 days ago. Within the last 2 days, we haven't really seen a lot of Jace Lux, so I'm kind of keeping my eye on this one. Has it fallen off? Are players just taking a hiatus from it? Did it just not top these 2 tournaments? Because it's really hard to look at daily tournaments that have a relatively similar player pool from the day-to-day and base all of my meta assumptions off of that. So I will have a much better idea after this weekend when we get the big open tournaments from the Mastering Runeterra GGToor event, as well as the Online League Series, because, again, those big events just give us a much better idea into what a general player base is going to be playing. Feel a little bit more prepared for the seasonal, because it's possible that with these same players, I think it's usually 40 or so players entering these Mastering Runeterra dailies, that players are starting to get a little anti-meta-y on each other, looking to just skill gap the weaker players, and then, you know, just sort of anti the good players. And what we've seen over the last couple of days is just a huge uptick in Shurima. Shurima's been a lot of the top cut for a lot of these tournaments, but it's really doubling down in the last couple of days. So we will see if players are coming out in these open tournaments looking to counter Shurima, if Shurima can survive in the open field. That's really what we're looking towards. But Jace Lux, I feel, is a solid deck. And actually, I did really like Lux Aphelios, but I'm not convinced that this is the best Lux deck or the best Aphelios deck. So as much as I like Lux Aphelios, I think it does go down into tier 3. And then Draven Scion is something that I was actually rather surprised it got buffed, because it was doing pretty well in fight nights. You know, it was picking up wins here and there on, I think every server had at least one top 4 finish of a Draven Scion deck in a fight night. Usually they were splashing in a Vi, but now with the attack buff back onto Scion, we are back on the burn plan. A lot of these lists are running Decimate again. I liked the Decimate lists initially, and then I kind of really got off of them as I started to see them play more, and you'd watch these clunky hands with, like, you would draw 2 Decimate and a Scion, and all of a sudden, you know, it's turn 11, and your Scion still hasn't leveled because you just drew burn spells. It's definitely a lot more reliant on drawing Lost Soul to level Scion than previous versions of the deck. But that doesn't necessarily, like, that's not a bad thing per se, because if you do draw the Lost Souls, then your deck is a fine-oiled machine. It runs very smooth. The Decimates are going to help finish off your opponents, and Scion did get that 1 attack back. The burn strategy feels a little bit better than it did when you had less attack, and the burn wasn't as effective, so I hope that makes some semblance of sense. I got off of them as I started to see them play more, and you'd watch these clunky hands with, like, you would draw 2 Decimate and a Scion, and all of a sudden, you know, it's turn 11 and your Scion still hasn't leveled because you just drew burn spells. It's definitely a lot more reliant on drawing Lost Soul to level Scion than previous versions of the deck. But that doesn't necessarily, like, that's not a bad thing per se, because if you do draw the Lost Souls, then your deck is a fine-oiled machine. It runs very smooth. The Decimates are going to help finish off your opponents, and Scion did get that 1 attack back. The burn strategy feels a little bit better than it did when you had less attack, and the burn wasn't as effective, so I hope that makes some semblance of sense. And then finally, as we get down into Tier 3, we have Tri-Beam Control, which I think has the most one-sided matchup in Legends of Runeterra at the moment, where it only has a 20% win rate into Field of Rush. Sundisk versus Darkness might still be in the same area, but as far as I know, FTR versus Tri-Beam is the most one-sided matchup that I would say is going to be commonplace in tournaments, because we're not seeing a lot of Darkness. But Tri-Beam's, like, it's pretty polarizing. I'm not in love with it right now. The Ezreal change is something that a lot of people, I wouldn't say overreacted about, but we haven't really found that Ezreal deck that's insane like everybody kind of thought it would be. Tri-Beam, obviously, sort of the standard Ezreal deck, the one that we're falling back on, still trying it out. But overall, I think the deck is like in a fine place. I think a lot of Tier 3 decks are in fine places. Pirates and Spiders, a lot of times people talk about running triple aggro to target the Pantheon, target the Sundisk. There's a reason we're not seeing a lot of triple aggro. It doesn't work as well as you really want it to for the volatile position you're putting yourself in against the rest of the field, because there's a fair amount of Demacia running around, which means a fair amount of Radiant Guardian, because a lot of the Lux decks will run Radiant Guardian, or like there's random Targon decks running around that are like, oh, I have Guiding Touch and I have Star Shaping. Even with the buffs to Ionia, we're starting to see more tasty Fey Folk decks, Viego Ionia being a great example of that. And ultimately, aggro is just not in the best spot it's ever been. Not the worst spot by any stretch of the imagination. I would expect to see a couple of triple aggro lineups into the top cut of the seasonal, but maybe not pure triple aggro. Like maybe we see a Draven Scion paired in there. I know a lot of players are starting to look at Draven Rumble Scion or Draven Rumble Vi, stuff like that to really round out the triple aggro lineup. You're not going like Spiders, Pirates, and then another 3-1 drop aggro deck. But that's the way that it's been for a few metas now, where you play your Spiders, you play your Pirates, and then you pick the flavor of the week third aggro deck. For a while, it was Draven Scion. For a little bit after that, it was like Ziggs Gnar. After that, I don't even really remember. But now we're kind of going back into a more Piltover and Zon Noxus variant for that third aggro deck. Darkness, we'll see. Darkness and Lee were like the solid fallback seasonal decks from Beyond the Bandlewood to Magic Misadventures. And now with the nerfs that they've taken coming into A Curious Journey, I'm just kind of reserving on them. We'll see how it goes, right? Yordles and Arms, I think, is underrated right now. The +4/+4 down to +3/+3 was obviously impactful, but I don't know that it's so impactful that players should be dropping this deck en masse, especially when you are probably still doing fine into Pantheon and Shurima. But that's one of those things where, like, I'm not seeing Yordles and Arms, which leads me to believe that the people that play Legends of Runeterra more than I do have decided that this isn't good enough into Sundisk, Cecilia, Pantheon. So Yordles and Arms is definitely one of those decks that I'm keeping a close eye out for this weekend. Even if it doesn't top, I want to go find out how close it got to topping, look through the top 16 list, all that kind of stuff, so that I can give you guys a good idea of where this deck will actually stand come seasonal time. Sivir, doing fine, doing whatever. There's a lot of decks that are like, oh, I'm looking to beat the random shit that isn't tier 1, and those are probably beating Sivir, which is why it's kind of down here. But Sivir is also one of those decks that you bring where you're like, oh yeah, I'm going to beat the things that aren't tier 1. I'll come back on that one. Lux Aphelios, like I said, probably not the best Lux deck, probably not the best Aphelios deck, still a solid deck. Sentinel Control. I like it. I don't love it. I've never really loved Sentinel Control. It got some early tops in the Mastering Runeterra events, but it is a Jace deck, and I think it just kind of got pushed to the side by the flavor of the week that is Jace Lux. So gonna keep an eye on which Jace deck comes out on top this weekend. I think Jace Lux is something that players are refining a little bit more, really looking to experiment with a little bit more. So we'll see how it goes, but Sentinel Control certainly in a fine spot. And then Lee Sin, the big question that I have for the community right now is, can Targon Lee Sin maintain its 100% top rate coming into the Curious Journey seasonal? It is the only deck that has topped every single seasonal. And I have to say Targon Lee Sin, not Zoe Lee Sin, because Zoe did not exist for the Monuments of Power seasonal, so it was all Zed Lee Sin. So Targon Lee Sin, I'm looking at you. Lee Sin Victor, I'm not super big on. It got a couple of early wins at the Mastering Runeterra events, but then we kind of saw it fall off pretty quickly. Not really in love with the way that it's sitting after the ambush and the ballistic bot nerfs, but we'll see if it's a fluke that it's not coming up anymore or all that kind of stuff. The tier 3 decks, I'm kind of in flux on a lot of them. As you can see, there's a lot of decks here. There's a lot of information to try and bring in. I don't have like sturdy opinions on all 20 decks or however many we're looking at here, and I'm really hoping to kind of nail that down over the weekend once I have this big tournament to look at, rather than hyper focusing on these Mastering Runeterra tournaments and letting that completely dictate the way that I'm thinking about the meta. So this is where everything kind of settles after I look at those events, take it with a grain of salt, look at Fight Night, and just personal bias, because tier lists are always going to be biased. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm feeling on everything. So looking forward to this weekend. I'll be casting the Online League Series with Jay Doza. I think he said we're not casting day 1. He has something that he has to do, but we will be there for the top cut on day 2. And yeah, go sign up for either the Online League Series or the Mastering Runeterra tournament. The sign up for both of those will be in the description below. Both of them are free to enter. $500 prize pool on the Mastering Runeterra event, $100 prize pool on the Online League Series. So pick the event that works for you, the field that you want to test in, all that kind of good stuff. And I will see you guys on Wednesday for the super in-depth tournament tactician that leads into the seasonal tournament. Thank you so much for watching. As always, my name is Boulevard. Good luck in your tournaments.